Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are now on our chapter 16, entitled The Filipino Novel in English by Caroline S. Howe. As a field of literary practice, the Filipino novel in English is constructed out of a series of paradoxes, created out of the solitary act of writing and consumed through the solitary act of mute reading. The novel is nevertheless fundamentally premised on accessibility to a wider public and for this reason appears to the most commonwealth of all literary writings. Most of its practitioners belong to the middle classes, yet it seeks to speak not just of and for these classes, but for and to the Filipino people. The novel is the preeminent genre through which society speaks and conceives of itself, but its concern with imagining it whole is routinely couched in the form of language of individual lived experience. It is European in provenance yet charged with the task of conveying a specifically Filipino content. The most influential Filipino novel was not written in English, and neither was it written in a Philippine language. The novel is a commodity, yet it often insists that it obeys no laws other than its own, purely eternal ones. Finally, despite its stated importance for the nation, the Filipino novel is largely unread by the majority of Filipinos. Filipino novelists in English write within a multilingual setting defined by the historical experience of colonization, the political projects of nation and state building, the pragmatic dictates of the increasingly commodified and globalized everyday life, the enduring loyalties commanded by group ties at the and supranational levels, and the problematic nature of the novel itself as a form of literary expression. This chapter examines the social, ideological, and linguistic context within which the Filipino novel in English takes shape. A contested terrain that is fraught with tension, anxiety, and ambivalence, the novel in English works through the difficult legacies and imperatives of colonial, nationalist, and capitalist modernity in the Philippines, and is implicated in the mechanics of nation, state, class, and subject formation without being completely reducible to them. The verse section of this chapter looks at the novel as a literary institution by examining the social conditions of its production, circulation, and reception. The second section tackles the ideological tenets underpinning the relationship between the novel and the nation. The final section addresses the question of English and its fraught position in the Philippine setting and concludes with a discussion of the potentials and limits of the novel. And now let us proceed to the novel as literary institution. If the most fundamental feature of the novel is its essential dependence on the book, its development can only be found with the creation of a literature public with the leisure, inclination, and income to read, write, and buy novels. The integration of colonial Philippines into the world market in the 19th century led to the expansion of colonial state capacity, increased urbanization, the spread of literacy, and the development of print culture and the creation of a small class of planters, professionals, and intellectuals, the latter consisting of young men from relatively affluent or influential families which could afford to send their sons to Europe for higher education. The foremost representative of this class of illustrados, literally enlightened, the national hero Jose Rizal wrote his two landmark novels, No Limitang Hire in the year 1887 and El Filibusterismo in year 1891 in Spanish. But it is sign of how inaccessible Spanish has become to present-day Filipinos that these masterpieces are now read only in translation. Efforts to teach Spanish were hampered by lack of funds, by the paucity of teachers, the absence of an organized systems of primary education, and the scarcity of teaching materials. The conservative estimate based on 1870 census, it is the only 2 or 3% of the population spoke Spanish near the end Spanish colonial rule. The career of English as an official language and medium of instruction differed in a degree of relative success of its dissemination and its entrenchment in state policies and the public imagination. U.S. President William McKinley instructed the fact-finding Philippine Commission to regard as of first importance that extension of a systems of primary education which shall be free for all and which shall fit the people for the duties of citizenship. While education was the cornerstone of American colonial rule and crucial to the colonial state building, especially the creation of the state agencies staffed by civil servants, it was accomplished on the cheap with already limited financial resources being allocated disappropriately to urban centers and municipalities at the expense of schools in the outlying villages. By the tail end of the American period, according to the 1939 census, 26.6% claimed the ability to speak English, while Tagalog was spoken by 25.4% of the population, Cebuano by 16.9%, Hiligaynon 14.1%, and Waray 19.1%. In other words, more people spoke English in 20 years than spoke Spanish in 3 centuries. But while these statistics are suggestive of the relative preeminence of English over the Philippine languages, they also underscore the fact that no single language, not even English, was spoken by a clear majority of the Filipino people. Indeed, writing in the Philippine languages, especially in Tagalog, flourished during the early decades of American colonial rule and far surpassed the novelistic output in English. One reason for this is state support, as the Philippine state has regularly encouraged the writing of a Philippine novel by sponsoring literacy contests as parts of its own nation-building mandate to promote culture and the arts. In commemoration of the centenary of the Philippine Revolution in 1998, the Fidel Ramos administration awarded prizes to novels by Eric Gamalinda, Charleston Ong, Alfred Yuson, and Azucena Grajo Uranza. A second reason is the role played by private, non-profit, and educational institutions both inside and outside of the century in encouraging literary activity. In the Philippines, the Carlos M. Palanca Memorial Awards began accepting submissions in the novel category in 1980. Filipino writers have also been recipients of various studies in writing grants and a great number of works as journalists, editors, columnists, and speech writers and freelance writers. The third and by far the most crucial engine of continued literary production in the Philippines is academia, one of the principal sources of employment for writers. Literary workshops, notably at Silliman University and the University of Philippines, complement the ongoing institutionalization of Philippine literature courses and concentrations, and more recently, creative writing programs in various universities. Writers like Buenavenido Santos and N.V.M. Gonzalez taught at universities in the Philippines and the United States. Finally, the publishing boom that followed the EDSA revolution in 1986 witnessed the revitalization of the publishing industry with New Days, Giraffe, Solidaridad, Anvil, University of the Philippines Press, University of Santo Tomas Press, De La Salle University Press, Ateneo de Manila University Press, and now defunct Kalikasan and Bookmark, bringing out or printing works of fiction. Defining characteristics of the Filipino novel in English. It is a testament to the Filipinos' novel's tenacious survival that nearly 240 novels in English have been published in book form since Zoleo M. Galang's A Child of Sorrow. The conditions under which the novels have been produced and the social locations of the novelists themselves point to a number of defining characteristics of the Filipino novel in English. First, its production and reception are restricted to a minority of cultural workers in the publishing, journalism, and educational sectors, and to a small percentage of the student and professional population in the Philippines. A fact that counts for the seemingly incestuous nature of literary production and consumption, and the preeminence of a personal politics of authorship in the country. Second, its selective territorialization beyond the territorial boundaries of the Philippine nation state through the Filipino diaspora, and third, the shadow cast by the former colonial power and the current hegemon, the United States, as a source of international exposures and educational training, knowledge production, and intellectual and the artistic validation. Novel and nation. The obvious limitations and restrictions which condition the writing of the Philippine novel in English are at striking variance with the amplitude and ambitions of the novel as genre. The novel, as both product and carrier of modernity, is closely entwined with the formation of the nation state, and for this reason has been terrorized as no less than the analog, if not formal, condition of possibility of the nation. Nationalism, according to Marxist critic theory, Egleton speaks of this entry into full self-realization of a unitary subject known as the people. Nationalist rhetoric and practice are grounded in assumptions which basically define the history and life of the nation in the terms of progressive and complete development of human faculties. Culture established an indissoluble link between individual self-cultivation and the development of peoples and nations. Individual self-cultivation did not merely provide an analogy for the concept of the historical development of nations. It became an important model for and contribution to the actual self-development of the nation. Education was crucial to advancing culture as a normative concept which encompassed not just the process but the resulting state or product of cultivation, and not just individuals but entire societies. The problem of culture as self-realization of freedom is posed by N.V.M. Gonzalez, The Winds of April in year 1941, an artist novel which deals with the youth and development of the writer as a free subject oscillating between a countryside subject to the depredations of nature and hard labor and a glittering city of the throes of ceaseless transformation. The novel is rife with images of movement and travel. The protagonist finds himself on horseback, on a ship and a train, with an airplane hovering above, and captures the restlessness and mobility of youth whose inchoate longings and future-oriented perspective are suggested by the openness of the novel. Social class and the other within. The notion of a divided Philippine society derives its impetus from a powerful social ideal which asserts the existence of a Filipino national collectivity that is founded, at least theoretically, on the formal aggregation of individuals regardless of their economic status, their religion, education, ethnicity, and gender. Yet, it also registers the failure of Philippine social realities to live up to the ideal. In a country in which the disparity between rich and poor is all too visible, and where social hierarchies are organized along class, ethnic, religious, and gender lines, and the concept of existing, if not antagonist, social divisions is empirically confirmed by the national traumas birthed by World War II and its bitter and equally devised aftermath, which produced the Hawk, communist and Islamic separatist movements and the mass upheavals of EDSA 1, 2, and 3. The great divide between the so-called elite and the masses looms large in the intellectual imagination, even as the Philippine scholarship has recast the masses not as passive followers of a great man, but as the true subjects of Filipino histories, the true agents of social transformation. The valorization of the nation as people assumes that as a social field is carved out into exclusive and incomparable enclaves occupied by the elite. On the one hand, the masses, on the other hand. Not unexpectedly, the nationalist discourse which creates the wound in social theory is also conscripted to structure it. The question of language. The novel's link with the nation inevitably brings up the question of language. The introduction of English as a language of literary expression did not merely create a new body of writing but recorded the Philippine literary tradition, modifying its properties and internal relationship. With the coming of English, writing in Spanish receded into the archives while writing in vernacular drifted down the cultural scale lost the best minds of the generation and had to fend for itself outside academic and critical circles. At present, English writers face the problem of alienation from a wider Filipino readership and the immediacy of Philippine realities. Furthermore, early Filipino writers' desire for American validation fostered a colonial syndrome that allowed them to feast on scraps of recognition coming from the cultural masters and proclaim themselves inheritors of Shakespeare's without first defining their relations with their immediate environment. And now, let us proceed to our conclusion. While Filipino writers can now choose their language on aesthetic grounds, the community of readers demanded and to an extent created by the novel in English will necessarily be limited, as Isagani Cruz has argued to those who are or can be versed in the specialized kind of English read only by those who read a lot of literature. Part of the price the novel pays for the specialization of its readership is its diminished significance in public life. But we need only remember the impact that Rizal's novels had on development of Philippine nationalism despite his novels' limited circulation to realize that the issue is not a simply one of novels in fruitless search of readers. The fact that Rizal was executed by the Spanish colonial state partly on the evidence of his past works and writings shows how far removed the contemporary novel is from a time when acts of literature had political repercussions and were capable of inspiring political action. Casper's contention that the indirectness of literary expression can only unleash invisible arrows is but a partial answer. The writers who ran awful of the dictatorship took the writing seriously enough to put their words into practice. It may well be the invisibility of their arrows kept these arrows from hitting their targets, but this is not mere consequence of the novel's subsistence on the waning value of literature in a digital age, a waning that happily enough has not prevented writers from writing. Perhaps the arrows were blunted in part by the corralling of the novel within the very field of the writing in English that has kept the novel alive but tends to limit the activity of reading and writing literature solely to encounters with text and in only one language. The inability of the literary field to translate the novel's call for nouns, tolerance, openness, and critic into active intention in and transformation of the world ultimately improvises not only the novel but also the images, thoughts, practice, and languages by which Filipinos live the experiences that the novel seeks to represent. And that would be all for our Chapter 16, The Filipino Novel in English by Caroline S. Howe. I hope that you have understand this topic. Thank you and God bless.